All right, so today we're going back in time a bit. We're going to be looking at some declassified CIA research.
Oh, wow.
From 1962
Okay.
on mescaline and LSD.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very cool.
People have been asking for a deep dive on kind of the relationship there and how the effects compare.
Sure.
So we've got this document
Right,
that's going to guide us.
Okay, great.
By the end, hopefully you'll understand not only how these substances differ,
Yeah.
but also some of the surprising ways that they overlap,
Okay.
especially when it comes to their potency and the phenomenon of cross-tolerance.
It's fascinating stuff to see, how researchers were approaching this back then, especially considering, the evolving understanding we have today
Right.
of psychedelics.
Absolutely, yeah. It's always interesting to see kind of how the science has evolved.
Mhm.
Okay, so this study lays out two main experiments. In the first one, researchers were looking to compare the effects and equivalent dosages of LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin across 10 subjects.
Okay.
Psilocybin, of course, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms.
Right. So kind of like a head-to-head to see how these substances stack up against each other in terms of the experience they produce.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And for the second experiment, they used what's called a crossover design,
Okay.
meaning each of those 10 subjects would experience both LSD and mescaline at different points in time. And the goal here was to investigate this concept of cross-tolerance, the idea that if you build up a tolerance to one drug, you might also become tolerant to another drug in a similar class.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this part is particularly relevant, for understanding potential therapeutic applications down the line.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So let's jump into the effects. What really surprised me was just how similar LSD and mescaline were in terms of both the physical and mental changes they produced in the subjects.
Yeah, that's a key observation, and one that I think really challenges some preconceived notions about how different these substances are. The study found that both LSD and mescaline cause things like dilated pupils, elevated body temperature, blood pressure, and even like a decrease in the knee-jerk reflex.
Wow. So it seems like both substances really put the body through a physiological roller coaster ride.
Yeah, for sure.
What about the mental and emotional effects? Did those mirror each other too?
They did, yeah. Subjects reported experiencing anxiety, shifts in their mood often towards euphoria, trouble thinking clearly, and distorted sensory perceptions, especially in the visual realm.
So we're talking about the classic psychedelic visuals, hallucinations, that sort of thing.
Precisely, yeah.
Okay.
And while both substances elicited these effects, the study uncovered a key difference in their time-action courses.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Yeah, so it turned out that mescaline acted much more slowly than LSD. Its effects took longer to appear, peaked later, and generally lingered for a longer period. LSD, on the other hand, was kind of like a quick burst of energy in comparison, rapid onset, intense peak, and a relatively shorter overall duration.
So if LSD is like a sprinter, mescaline is more of a marathon runner.
A perfect analogy, yeah.
Okay.
And this difference in how they unfold over time has important implications for how they're used and experienced.
Okay, so similar effects, but different timelines. Now get this. When it came to potency, the study found a truly wild discrepancy.
Yeah, it was quite remarkable. LSD tartrate was found to be somewhere between 2,400 to 4,900 times more potent than mescaline hydrochloride, and even more potent when compared on a molecular basis.
Wow, that's a massive difference.
Yeah.
So we're talking about needing a significantly larger dose of mescaline to achieve the same level of effects as a tiny amount of LSD.
Exactly, yeah. So the study used LSD tartrate and mescaline hydrochloride, two specific forms of these substances.
Right.
And the difference in their potency is partly related to their chemical structures. But beyond that, it really speaks to the incredible power of LSD, even in minuscule quantities.
Yeah, pretty mind-blowing to think about. Okay, so let's unpack this idea of cross-tolerance a bit more. You mentioned that it comes into play when someone develops a tolerance to one drug and then becomes tolerant to another related drug. But how does that play out in the context of this study?
Right, so the researchers divided their subjects into two groups. One group received LSD every day for 2 weeks to build up a tolerance, while the other group did the same with mescaline. Afterwards, they gave both groups doses of both LSD and mescaline. And what they found was really remarkable. The subjects who had developed a tolerance to LSD were also less responsive to mescaline.
Really?
And vice versa.
Wow. So it's like their bodies learned a trick from one substance and applied it to the other.
That's one way to think about it, yeah.
Interesting.
And what's particularly fascinating is that This cross-tolerance wasn't just some random fluke. It points to this deeper connection between these substances, suggesting that they might be interacting with similar pathways or mechanisms in the brain.
That's a really intriguing point. But to play devil's advocate for a second, couldn't there be other explanations for this cross-tolerance effect? Could it be something about the study participants themselves, or maybe just a quirk of how these particular forms of LSD and mescaline were metabolized?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. And while this study, on its own, can't definitively rule out every alternative explanation, the findings are certainly strong evidence in favor of a shared mechanism of action. And what's important to remember is that this research was conducted over 60 years ago.
Right.
And back then, our understanding of neuroscience and the complexities of the brain was far more limited than it is today.
Right, so there's a lot more we know now about how drugs interact with our bodies and minds. But even with those limitations, this study still offers some pretty groundbreaking insights.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it lays the groundwork for a deeper exploration of these shared pathways, which could have significant implications for our understanding of how psychedelics work and their potential for therapeutic use. And that's the beauty of scientific inquiry, right?
Yeah.
Even decades-old research can spark new questions
Totally.
and avenues for exploration.
Absolutely. I love that. Okay, so we've got this intriguing hint about a potential shared mechanism.
Yeah.
But how did they actually go about measuring all these effects?
Right.
Back in '62.
Yeah.
What did their experimental setup look like?
So for the first experiment, the one comparing the effects of LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin,
Right.
they meticulously monitored the subject's physical responses. They measured things like body temperature, pulse rate, blood pressure, and even pupil size at various time points after administering each substance.
That makes sense. But those are all outward physical signs.
Right.
How did they capture the more subjective psychological aspects of the experience? I mean, you can't exactly stick a thermometer in someone's mind to measure their hallucinations, right?
Right. And that's where things get a bit more nuanced.
Okay.
The researchers developed a detailed questionnaire designed to capture the subject's inner experiences.
Makes sense.
This questionnaire included questions about their mood, their thought processes, sensory perceptions, and any unusual experiences they were having.
So it was like a structured way to get a glimpse into what was going on inside their minds during the psychedelic experience.
Yeah, they were trying to quantify the subjective in a way that allowed for comparison between the different substances.
Gotcha.
And to further standardize their observations, they used a clinical grading scale to assess the overall intensity of the experience for each subject.
Interesting. So they weren't just relying on anecdotal reports. They were trying to bring some objective measurements into the mix.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this was crucial for ensuring the scientific rigor of the study, even with the inherent challenges of studying subjective experiences like those induced by psychedelics.
Right. Makes sense. Okay, now let's revisit experiment 2.
Yeah.
The one that explored cross-tolerance. You mentioned they use a crossover design.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through how that worked in practice?
Of course. So they divided those 10 subjects into 2 groups. One group received LSD daily for 14 days to build up tolerance, while the other group did the same with mescaline.
Okay.
Then, after the 14 days, they crossed over.
Okay.
Each group received doses of both LSD and mescaline to see how their prior exposure to one substance affected their response to the other.
I see. So it's like they were intentionally creating a tolerance to one psychedelic to see if it spilled over onto the other.
Right.
And the results showed that it did.
That's right. The participants who developed a tolerance to LSD were less sensitive to the effects of mescaline.
Wow.
And vice versa.
It really drives home the point that these substances, despite their differences, are working on some shared level within the brain.
And that realization has opened up a whole new avenue of research into the mechanisms of action for psychedelics.
Yeah.
What we're seeing is that it's not just about the individual molecule, but about the intricate ways those molecules interact with complex systems within the brain.
That's a great point. It's like we're starting to see the forest for the trees.
Exactly.
Moving beyond just focusing on the individual effects of each substance.
Right.
And recognizing the broader patterns at play.
Exactly. And this broader perspective is what's driving a lot of the current excitement in psychedelic research.
So we've talked about the effects, the potency, the cross-tolerance, and even how the study was conducted back in the early 60s. But before we jump into the big picture implications of all this, there's one more piece of the puzzle I'm curious about. Remember how the first experiment also included psilocybin?
Ah, yes. The magic mushroom compound.
Right. What did they find in terms of psilocybin's effects compared to LSD and mescaline? Did it also exhibit this cross-tolerance phenomenon?
That's a great question. And while this particular CIA document focuses primarily on LSD and mescaline,
Okay.
they did observe that psilocybin produced a similar range of effects
Oh, okay.
to the other two drugs.
So similar visuals, changes in mood, that sort of thing.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And while this specific study didn't directly test for cross-tolerance between psilocybin and the other two,
Okay.
there's already a substantial body of research suggesting that cross-tolerance does indeed exist between LSD and psilocybin.
So if we were to add psilocybin to our psychedelic Venn diagram,
Yeah.
it seems like there's a significant overlap with both LSD and mescaline.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this overlap in effects, coupled with the evidence for cross-tolerance,
Yeah.
strengthens the argument for a shared mechanism of action across these three substances.
Wow, that opens up a whole new level of intrigue. It's like we're not just talking about individual substances anymore, but about a whole class of psychedelics that are interconnected in ways we're only beginning to understand.
And that's where the real excitement lies. If we can pinpoint these shared pathways and understand how these substances exert their effects at a fundamental level,
Yeah.
it could revolutionize our approach to treating a wide range of mental health conditions.
That's a pretty tantalizing thought. We've come a long way from dilated pupils and altered moods, haven't we?
Right.
We're now talking about the potential to unlock new therapeutic avenues based on the fundamental biology of these substances.
Absolutely. And it all stems back to this groundbreaking research from the 1960s,
Yeah.
which, despite its limitations, has laid the groundwork for a whole new era of psychedelic exploration.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
But let's get down to brass tacks. What does all this mean for our listener? Why should they care about the similarities between mescaline and LSD, this whole cross-tolerance phenomenon, and the potential shared mechanisms of action?
Yeah, that's the key organ, isn't it? It's not just about the fascinating science. It's about the potential impact this knowledge has on our lives. For starters, these findings really challenge us to rethink how we categorize and understand psychedelics as a whole.
So we're moving beyond just seeing them as individual substances with unique effects and starting to appreciate their interconnectedness.
Exactly. The cross-tolerance observed in this study and in subsequent research
Right.
hints at a deeper level of interaction within the brain than previously thought. It suggests that these substances, despite their distinct chemical structures, may be tapping into shared neural pathways or influencing similar networks of neurotransmitters.
Okay, so there's a potential common thread running through these seemingly different psychedelic experiences.
Yeah.
But how does that translate into real-world applications?
Well, imagine if we could pinpoint the specific brain regions or neurotransmitter systems that these substances are modulating. That knowledge could pave the way for developing highly targeted therapies for a range of conditions.
So we're talking about moving beyond the one drug, one disease model and potentially addressing the root causes of these conditions through a deeper understanding of brain function.
Precisely. And the conditions that could potentially benefit from this approach are incredibly diverse. We're talking about depression, anxiety addiction, PTSD, even conditions like chronic pain or cluster headaches, which are notoriously difficult to treat.
That's a pretty wide spectrum. It seems like we're on the cusp of a new era of psychedelic medicine, one informed by a more nuanced understanding of how these substances interact with the brain.
And what's even more exciting is that we're seeing this shift happening in real time.
Yeah.
Research on psychedelics is experiencing a renaissance, and the stigma that has surrounded these substances for decades is gradually fading.
Yeah. It's like we're finally catching up to the potential that researchers glimpsed back in the 60s, but with the added benefit of decades of advancements in neuroscience and a more open-minded societal perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that this CIA study, while groundbreaking, was limited by the technology and understanding at the time. It was conducted on a small group of former opiate addicts,
Okay.
which adds another layer of complexity to the findings.
That's right. The fact that the study participants had a history of opiate addiction makes me wonder about the implications for treating substance use disorders. Could this cross-tolerance effect, if further explored and understood, be harnessed to help people break free from addiction?
That's a very intriguing question, and one that researchers are actively investigating. The idea of leveraging cross-tolerance between psychedelics and other addictive substances holds tremendous promise, but it requires careful study, and a deep understanding of the underlying mechanisms.
It seems like every answer we uncover just leads to more fascinating questions. This deep dive has taken us from dilated pupils to the potential revolution in mental health treatment. It's incredible to see how a single study can spark so much exploration and open up entirely new avenues for scientific inquiry.
And that's the beauty of science. It's a constant process of discovery and refinement. This CIA study, while limited in scope, has provided a foundation upon which we can build a deeper understanding of psychedelics, their effects, and their potential to improve human lives.
Yeah, for our listener, I think the key takeaway here is that we're only just scratching the surface when it comes to understanding the complexities of psychedelics. This research on mescaline and LSD hints at a much larger interconnected web of brain activity and the potential for harnessing that knowledge to address some of humanity's most pressing health challenges.
And who knows what other discoveries await us as we continue to delve deeper into this fascinating realm. Perhaps someday, thanks in part to the pioneering work of researchers decades ago, we'll have a whole new toolkit for treating mental health conditions and enhancing human well-being.
It's a future I'm incredibly excited to see unfold. And for those listening, remember, stay curious, keep asking questions, and never stop exploring the wonders of the human mind.